So just to give you a preview, my involvement starts at the very beginning when it was really just kind of a concept and some people were creating at that time called video description. And we went to Congress, and I don't know whether you want this story or not, but we went to Congress in 1996 and actually got a section written into what was then basically otherwise a deregulatory act to require video description. And unfortunately, when it went from one chamber of Congress to the other, in the end, Congress pulled out the requirement for video description, and they authorized the FCC to just write a report for video description. And then I went into the FCC. This was in the Clinton administration. And we didn't know whether we had enough authority to write actual requirements. So we did anyway, because we thought we would just do it. And I don't know if you know this history, but the cable industry and the movie industry, MPAA, they actually got it overturned. And so the rules got thrown out for lack of sufficient authority because they said, well, look, one chamber of House wanted it, one didn't. And really all they gave you was the authority to write a report. So jump ahead, in 2007, I was out of the FCC by that time. We went back to Congress and said, okay, now we really need the authority. And that's when we got it in the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act.
Mom, it sounds like, I don't want to interrupt you, but it sounds like this would probably be good for the show.
Hi, I'm Darren Revitz, and you're listening to the Audio Description Narrators of America Know Your Narrator series.
Today, we're very happy to have two very special guests. Our first is Karen Peltz Strauss. She's a legal consultant, former deputy chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and also one of the chief drafters of the audio description legal mandates. And her son, Daniel Strauss, who's an audio description narrator, audio description writer, and also an actor and writer in Los Angeles. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Let's start off with a question for you, Daniel. What do you love about audio description?
Oh, well, coming from a writing background and writing things like pilots or screenplays, writing audio description, I think has enhanced and colored my writing in a way that I never imagined it would. Learning to really look at, because I studied film in college as well, but this is just such a different way of looking at film and looking at what is in an image, what is important in an image, and then concisely describing that. It's a skill I think that I had already possessed on some level, but having the opportunity to sharpen that and get better and better at it and just describe something, there's the old saying, a picture tells 1,000 words, right? Well, trying to condense those 1,000 words into maybe a sentence is just a skill that I think has improved my work, again, not just in audio description, but in any of the writing that I do. So I really, really enjoyed that.
How about you, Karen?
Audio description brings television, the news, entertainment, the value of video programming to people who are blind and visually impaired in a way like it was never before available. So allowing people to participate in a mainstream activity like this, especially now during the COVID pandemic, having full access to programming just the same way as other people do is really critically important.
And Karen, can you share a little bit about your experience both in the FCC and other advocacy efforts specifically with audio description? Obviously, the FCC is the exciting part.
Sure. So my experience with the FCC actually occurred in two parts. I first went to the commission in 1999, and this was after I had worked on audio description as a mandate. We went to Congress to try to get it to be a mandate. And in 1996, Congress did, in fact, or a portion of Congress, one chamber did, in fact, write legislation into a bill to mandate video description. Unfortunately, by the time the bill made its way through all of Congress, that was watered down to a report. In 1999, when I went into the commission, we were hoping that at least the legislative history was strong enough that the commission had the authority to draft audio description rules as requirements. And so we went ahead, and this was in 2000. We adopted rules requiring audio description on a portion of television programming. But unfortunately, segments of the industry, mostly the movie industry and the cable industry, challenged us in court, and they said that we did not have sufficient authority. We only had authority to write a report to analyze the benefits of what that time called video description. And so in around 2002, they threw out our rules, unfortunately. I left the commission in 2001, and at that point was on the outside working again with nonprofits, and we decided to form a coalition called the Coalition of Organizations for Accessible Technology to close technology gaps for people with disabilities generally. And one of the things we wanted to do was reinstate the audio description rules. And in fact, we were very fortunate. We worked very closely with Senator Markey and various other senators that were, and Congress. Actually, at that point, he was Congressman Markey, and they helped us develop a law called the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, CVAA for short, which reinstated the rules that the FCC had originally adopted. I can tell you a little bit more afterwards about that effort because it was the hardest component of the CVAA, and it almost killed the CVAA. And the CVAA had lots of different components: internet captioning, access to emergency programming, hearing aid compatibility. This was the toughest one to get through. In 2010, I returned to the FCC. I was brought in by the Obama administration, and we completed the reinstatement. We had been authorized this time by Congress, and we completed the reinstatement of the rules for audio description.
So many moving parts there. My goodness. Yeah. Daniel, your experience, obviously knowing what your mom's been involved with, how did you find audio description professionally?
I've lived here in LA for, I guess, nearly 4 years now, and work was slow. Acting, writing work can be hard to come by. So I was kind of looking for something different to do. And my mom had mentioned audio description to me before as, possibly something that I, might be suited for, and the timing just hadn't been right. And it so happened that I was really kind of looking for something to fill my time right around the summer of, I think it was 2017. And it was right around the time that the ACB conference was going on, or was about to go on. So, my mom said that I know this guy, Joel Snyder, and he does an intensive at the ACB every year, which I think they just held it was obviously virtual this year. So I don't even know if they did the intensive, but she said, why don't you sign up for this and go see if it's something you'd want to do? So I flew to Reno, which was just a hop, skip, and a jump from LA, and did the intensive, which was really cool because it brought together blind people, sighted people, all in the same room to just sort of talk about audio description and how it started and how it's implemented and what are the important things, because the initial thing that you have to figure out is, how do I look at this image and figure out what I'm supposed to say about it? And I can remember him putting up very, very simple images like logos for companies and being like, describe this, and being like, I don't know. So picking up that skill was like a really cool thing that weekend. And I remember they do a screening of a movie every year, and they did La La Land. And I remember we were watching La La Land, and it was a bunch of people who were blind and some sighted people as well. And I remember the first joke in the movie came on, which is like, if you've seen the movie, there's the beginning where everyone gets out and starts dancing on their cars. And it was described. So the voiceover said something like, everyone gets out and starts dancing on their cars. And, the whole room laughed. And that was like a real moment for me where I was like, this really works, because up until that point, it was just sort of something I was studying on paper. And all of a sudden I saw it in action. It was like, wow, that moment of everyone being able to enjoy the same moment together in a comparable experience was really, really cool. So after that, I finished up the intensive, and I said, I think this is something that I want to do. It seemed like there was a lot of work to be done in it, and I felt that I was suited for it. So I just sort of hit the ground running when I got back to LA, and calling up different people through, connections I'd made at the conference, through people that my mom knew, since, obviously she was so instrumental in making all this happen, this entire industry happen. And it's just sort of been a rolling stone gathering moss since then. As I talk to you now, I'm actually on deadline for something that has to be in by 4:30. And then I'm writing a whole nother like 7 hours of description this week. So it's just, for me, as soon as I started doing it, I was just sort of like, oh, this is good work, which it's so hard to find, I think, when you're an actor looking for something to pay the bills. Like, most people do pretty soul-crushing work, and it's really nice to do work that allows people to experience media and entertainment, people who are blind, in the same way that or a comparable way that a sighted person would. So that's sort of been my story of how I broke in and where I'm at now.
And that experience in La La Land that even Karen mentioned about the value of this work, that you were able to viscerally experience that, for everyone to laugh at the same time. That's connection. And Karen, I'm curious about your experience in talking with Daniel over the last few years. Have you found, obviously you've been instrumental in helping him from your perspective. Has he contributed anything to your perspective as far as audio description goes?
Completely. I'm the legal perspective. I'm the person that puts it on paper. But I was overwhelmed when Daniel first showed me his first demo. I was mesmerized. I was truly speechless at how extraordinarily articulate he was able, and how almost instinctively he was able to capture the visual and put it into the audio in ways that I couldn't have even begun to imagine. I was awestruck. And Dan, you remember when you said, and you showed me this, and I said, I can't believe that you can do this with such ease. Daniel has always been able to think on his feet as a former main stager of Second City in Chicago, improv for 10 years. I'm not as good as that, as you could tell. He just is very effusive in his ability to convey a message very easily, and his extensive vocabulary was, and again, ability to transfer to a blind person what is happening visually. I just was at burst with pride, and just being able to see it up front. We've also talked about the different ways of doing it, because Daniel has freelanced and not just done it for one company. We've shared stories about, or he shared with me, how different companies do it, and the different emphasis that each one puts on their approach. And I've thought a lot about that. It's fascinating to see the practical end of things.
Daniel, your mom mentioned about the craft and your history of performing, specifically with improv classes. Can you share some more examples in addition to what you have about some differences or some similarities to those other performances as far as the audio description? Let's start with narration.
Narration pulls directly from all of my training. I mean, improvisation, general acting. I mean, narration is the thing that's the most, like, when I do it, this is just me using the skills that I've been practicing for my entire life in performing. I mean, especially like, if you have a brisk cue in between two tight sentences and you've got to kind of get in there and get out, how do you put the right inflection on those words to make sure you still get the message across, even when you have to say it as quickly as this, something like that. Or even making sure that you match the energy of the show, which is like a big thing in the audio description world right now, of like watching a movie and listening to the description and just being like, this description doesn't match this show. There was a whole podcast, I think, that I listened to a while ago about the description for the movie Black Panther, that the description was done sort of like by a stuffy sounding British person. And a lot of people who saw it were really upset, because they were like, here's this movie that's about like Black people and Black culture, and this voice just doesn't sound attached to what I'm hearing is on the screen. So making sure that you do that you're matching whatever it is you're describing, I think is, again, something that pulls from improv training, that pulls from acting training. So, I mean, in narration, I mean, it's like, it's interesting. You have to walk a line between, you're not an actor in the show, and you're not even necessarily, if you really do your job, ideally people barely realize that you're there, but there is a performance in that too. I had a funny experience once where I was walking down the street here in LA, and I walked past a restaurant where a woman who was a central character on one of the shows that I narrated was having dinner. She was sitting outside. And there was like part of me that wanted to like run up to her and be like, excuse me, we work together. Excuse me, but I know you. I actually work on your show. I'm actually one of the actors on your show. You just don't know. And if I tried to explain to you what I did, it would probably take me a while for you to, and I didn't. I ended up not, because other people were bothering her and I wanted to leave her alone. But it is that feeling where you essentially are another performer on the show, just a very different performer from anyone else who's there.
Sure. Karen, it sounds like with all the different experiences that Daniel's had in the different companies, those different approaches, have you found you've changed? I'm not even sure if this is the legal side, but just maybe on the experience from your side, not only hearing his work, but hearing how the different companies approach audio description. What's your perspective on that?
You know, it's interesting. As an advocate for the underlying law, I've never really taken a position on how it should be provided. I leave it to the blind community. They know best. I think that right now they're grappling with what works. You may have heard of the Disability Advisory Committee at the FCC, and you may be hearing more about that from other guests that you have. But as I understand it right now, they have a proposal on the table for providing certain quality standards for video description. Just by analogy, several years ago when I was at the FCC, we adopted quality standards for closed captioning. But I will tell you that it took a long time to get those. Closed captioning started in the 1980s, was required in the mid-1990s. It took another 20 to 30 years to first get quality standards. So it took a while for the industry to kind of, I guess, experiment and see what works and what doesn't work. I know that, for example, some blind people say, don't bother telling me the colors. I was born blind. I don't know colors. Some people may like more description about emotions, how someone appears to be reacting, but then again, you're really not. I mean, I think others would say you're really not supposed to be going into that. I will tell you one thing, one little tidbit that's kind of interesting that maybe a lot of people don't know. I mentioned that getting audio description was very difficult. And again, we lost in 1996 when we tried to do it in Congress. One of the opponents was the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU charged that this was a First Amendment violation because it was the creation of speech, the forced creation of speech. And we pushed against that and said, no, it's an accessibility feature. But every now and then that First Amendment argument rears its ugly head. And obviously, generally, we all support the First Amendment. But in this case, it is an ugly thing. And in fact, just recently, I was told that in discussions at the Disability Advisory Committee, some of the industry were again questioning whether or not this is a First Amendment violation. The more it's considered creative, the more it runs that risk. The more it's considered accessibility, just providing, you've both used the words comparable, providing what's comparable for sighted people. The more it is seen as that, providing a level playing field or equality of opportunity to access programming, the better the argument that it has nothing to do with the First Amendment. I mean, I think that, frankly, I was surprised just recently, this is within weeks that I heard this. I think that generally the First Amendment issue is silenced. And I will tell you that the ACLU eventually revised its position around 2003 or so. They reconsidered and they pulled back. But they actually didn't only take this position, they actually testified before Congress against audio description on First Amendment grounds.
Daniel, when it comes to your creation, or I guess the accessibility, depending on how we find this balance, do you find that you use the writing of audio description to help your narration, or your narration to help your writing? Is there a connection there?
Yeah, every time that I come into a booth and do narration, I mean, there's been times where probably shouldn't say this, but there's been times where I've read description so good on the page that I'll like take a picture of it with my phone and be like, I have to like, not that I'm going to go home and plagiarize the description, but like they'll describe like a certain part of a rock or a cliff that I'll be like, oh, I have to remember that for the next time I'm doing a nature program. Like, so anytime. Now what's interesting is you do have, and my mom was talking about this a little bit, you do have different schools of thought at a lot of different places that you work. So at some places you might hear a word and be like, oh, I've got to use that word. And then you drop that word in description for another place. And they're like, that's not actually the kind of description that we do here. So it doesn't always cross over perfectly. But I mean, I think this is like anything. The more you can immerse yourself in it and the more you can open yourself up to experiencing it, the better you're going to get at doing it. The speed at which I write description now compared to like 2 years ago, it's completely different. And I think that's from just doing it constantly and from watching it constantly. I try when I'm just like watching TV by myself now to almost always turn on the description. And interestingly enough, I don't really hear it anymore. Like, I don't know if you find that as well, but like if it's playing, like it's just like, it used to, like if I watch a movie description, it would pull me out of it. And now it's just like, it's just the natural voice that dictates whatever's going on the screen. And it drives my kids crazy because sometimes I'll accidentally have it on for like a movie that my 5-year-old daughter is going to watch. And she'll be like, turn off the guy who talks, turn off the guy who talks. And I'm like, okay. Just don't you just want to watch a little bit of the beginning of Sing with an audio description narrator describing every animal character that appears on screen? And the answer is always no. But anyway, you asked a question 20 minutes ago. So I think that, it's just the more that I do either, whether it's writing or narrating, they both inform each other in a huge way.
There have been a couple of live performances with audio description. I think it was NBC Universal did a couple of staged musicals. And I turned on audio description and I loved it. And what it gave me was additional information that I wasn't perceiving about the background, about the grandeur of the musical. I think it's a missed benefit for a lot of people. Nobody knows what audio, I mean, I don't want to say nobody, but people that are not in this industry or using it generally don't know about audio description. And I think a lot more people would be enjoying it if they knew about it, especially people with cognitive impairments who could gain additional information about the programming that they're watching.
Great point. And that cited audience awareness of audio description can only help our blind audiences experience more of it with better quality.
I would just add really quickly, because closed captioning, which my mom was talking about a little bit, closed captioning really has become so central to our society of TV watchers at this point. Like, everyone knows about closed captioning. Everything is captioned. And especially with like the internet, with like GIFs and whatnot, people love to have, like, people make jokes about like, they'll have a picture and a caption on it so that you know whatever the joke is, even without watching the show. So closed captioning, like the idea of watching a show now and having it not be captioned, you'd be like, are you crazy? Why isn't this captioned? What's going on? So, I mean, obviously the goal is to someday get there with audio description so that you don't have to describe, although our job is to describe, but still not have to describe for 20 minutes what exactly it is and just be like, oh yeah, the program is audio described, just with the exact same vibe as the program is closed captioned.
Great comparison. And obviously the differences with closed captioning versus the creation of audio description is something we could also talk about. I'm curious about something that both of you have mentioned in each of your experiences with audio description, that you both have mentioned blind audiences being involved either in the creation or the guiding of the mandate. I'd love to hear from both of you about how our blind audiences, blind and low vision audiences, have contributed to your efforts.
In drafting the legislation, we worked very closely with the American Council of the Blind and the American Foundation for the Blind. They were front and central in every legislative battle. There is a third organization, National Federation of the Blind. We formed a coalition. It was actually a coalition of around 300 organizations nationwide. And NFB was one of the members of that coalition. So they were supportive when we did this in the CVAA, but it was ACB and AFB that were doing the drafting they really led the way on the drafting. I mean, I was the central attorney, but I wouldn't have known what to put in the law had it not been for them. So they were the ones that were telling me what to put in. And they were the ones that literally led me around Capitol Hill, around the halls of Capitol Hill, that they knew a lot better than I did, by the way. They might have taken my arm, but they were telling me where to go. And we visited all the Congress people, and that's how we got the law done. And then once I went to the FCC, the way the commission works is to develop rules. You write a notice of proposed rulemaking, and then you send it out to the public for comment. And they were very instrumental in providing comments and in coming in and providing us with background on what they thought they needed to go into the rules. Again, they were also members and remain members of the Disability Advisory Committee. So there's that committee meets on an ongoing basis at the FCC. And so they're constantly providing feedback on what should be in the rules.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just say, any and all involvement and inclusion from people in the blind community is essential to this work. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to work for companies that employ blind people to do sound mixing and engineering, and blind people to run the description process. And I think that's essential. I mean, ultimately, that's who we're creating this work for. We have the ability as sighted people to see what is on the screen and convey it, but we're not the consumers. The consumers are going to be the blind. So being able to attend that intensive with blind people in the room, getting to hear their reaction and opinion to description as it played on the screen. What did you think of this? Was this descriptive enough? There were exercises that we did where we would get instant feedback on it. So, any and all of that is essential to driving this work, because I can sit and write description that I think is excellent, but if I turn it in at an audience of people who are blind, say this didn't describe what we were watching and it took us out of it, or it didn't work for us, then what's the point?
Where would you like to see audio description go, just based on what you know now with all these different moving parts?
How much time do you have?
There we go. We've got, it's a podcast. We can go as long as you need.
Okay. So one thing that I didn't mention is that I also wrote the laws on closed captioning. So Daniel mentioned that the goal, obviously, is to have universal audio description. I mean, there are some programs where it may not be necessary, like news and some sports, where there's a running commentary. And actually, that's why the law exempts live and near live programming, although I would take out eventually that near live programming, because that is basically talk shows and those kinds of things could be described. But it has a long way to go, audio description, to get to where closed captioning is, to get to that level of acceptance. There's a lot of issues that need to be resolved. Probably the biggest one right now is outreach. I still think that there are tons of people out there that do not know that audio description exists. We're not talking about the people that join these organizations that we mentioned. They know, they get the newsletters, they get the emails, but there's a lot of people out there that have low vision. They could be senior citizens, they could have lost their sight later in life. And I think there's just having greater outreach is really, really important to reach all the masses. There's also still, although I believe it's ACB, but I know that they provide guides for what's available with audio description. So finding what is audio described on TV is not that easy. There are some central sites, but they're not necessarily, I think they're run by individual organizations. There's still also a problem with competition with the Spanish on the SAC channel, on the secondary audio programming channel. The way the FCC wrote the rules is that you have to pass through audio description unless the channel is being used for something else. That's really problematic. Back in the 1990s, I was on something called the Gore Commission, which was a commission designed to develop public interest obligations for digital broadcasters. And at that time, we were told, it was created by Vice President Gore, we were told that there would be enough streams to pass through video description along with Spanish, and it didn't happen. And so that remains a problem. You don't want to have competition with Spanish-speaking programming. So that's something else that needs to be resolved. And then just general expansion of the rules. I mean, it's unfortunate. I don't see this Congress doing that in the near future. And the FCC in 2016 adopted a series of proposed rules that, or actually proposed a series of rules that would have expanded it a little bit more. And that was right before the last presidential election. Some of the expansion did take place and some of it didn't. But in order to bring it into more programming, in order to have more hours covered, the FCC is probably not going to have a lot of sufficient authority to do that without additional legislation. So it means going back to Congress. And no one really wants to do that right now.
You said masses beyond the organizations that you've mentioned, and finding a way to access audio description in an easy way. And that SAP thing, that's, boy, that's frustrating.
Yeah, it's very frustrating.
How about you, Daniel? Where do you see audio description going?
I talked about it a little bit before, but getting it to a place where it is as understandable in mainstream culture as something like closed captioning, and where it kind of fills that same role that you wouldn't say to a person who's deaf, you know, hey, let's watch TV together. It's not captioned, but you know, you'll pick it up, you know, that we understand that is a very similar thing to say to a person who is blind, hey, let's watch TV. It's not described, but I mean, you'll get it. I mean, you can hear what they're saying. Well, no, there's going to be a ton of stuff that, I mean, just think about any montage. I mean, one of the interesting things, when you sit down to write audio description, sometimes I sit down and I'm like, maybe this program won't have a lot. Inevitably, nearly every program I write has a ton of description, because there is in a visual medium, there is a ton that is conveyed without dialogue. So getting it to that point where people understand how essential it is, and I guess, I don't know if this is the perfect word, but normalizing it more so that it's a more normal part of the mainstream culture. Also, I mean, I would echo what my mom said about accessibility of the accessibility, because I mean, I have shows that I've voiced, that I've gone into a booth, voiced the show, and then I go home and the show is streaming somewhere, and I'm like, oh, cool, I'll watch it, and I'll watch it with my description, and it's just not there. And that happens so frequently that when it is there, I'm shocked. Like literally, I had a show that I voiced, What We Do in the Shadows, on FX. I narrated that show. And I went on Hulu and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is here. I can actually watch it. I can actually pull some of it and use it for promotional materials. Like, I mean, the number of movies, and there are movies that are listed on, I think it's the ACB that has like a whole master list of programs that are described. There's movies on there that I've done, and I can't find the description for these movies. I don't know. They're listing that it's there, but when I go to Amazon, it's not denoted that it's there. I had a movie that I described that on Amazon, it said, this contains audio description. I rented the movie. There was no audio description. Now, for me, whatever, that's fine. I'll just get on the computer and return it. You know, I'll get a refund. But like, how frustrating must that be for a blind person who rented that movie to watch it? Not so that they could, you know, use it to hopefully, you know, secure further employment, like to just watch the movie. So to ramp up the actual accessibility of the accessibility, it's just nowhere near where it needs to be right now.
And people have trouble finding even, I mean, you're experienced in this. I mean, look at your difficulty. Can you imagine someone who has no idea? I mean, you at least know how to find the SAP channel, right? I mean, you know how to find.
I've never been able to watch audio description on the SAP channel. I mean, and also up until recently, I canceled it recently, but up until recently I was using live TV through Hulu, and doing that, I mean, I have no idea how I would access the audio description. I have absolutely no idea. Like, it has to be as simple as just toggling a button exactly like you would for closed captioning. You toggle the button on and it's on. You toggle the button off and it's off. That's it. So,
okay. So there is a law that obviously is not being followed, and probably complaints should be filed with the FCC, that people, well, this doesn't apply to you, Daniel, but people who are blind or visually impaired can request that their set-top boxes have the capability of providing controls to access audio description that are audibly accessible.
That's on like a cable box, right?
Yeah, cable.
So I mean, I used to use a cable box. I've turned audio description on my cable box. I haven't, it has never worked for me. It just hasn't worked. I mean, I've flipped through different channels. I found the setting on my cable box when I used a cable box. You know, I mean, I don't know. I didn't check every single channel on the TV, but
no, I mean, I think you're finding a gap in the law. There's a requirement that TVs, not cable boxes, but TVs, that if video description is built, the capability of watching video description is built into the device, there has to be a simple and easy to use method for activating audio description. But there is no comparable requirement for the set-top boxes, for the cable boxes. This is a long story. It's too long for today, but the bottom line is that it got nixed in Congress because at that time when we were writing the law, there was very little audio description on TV, and there was just people were hesitant to place too many requirements on, for example, the remote controls or the set-top boxes. And it's a huge gap. I mean, it's terrible. Part of the other problem is that the law right now doesn't even require the movies, like the Amazon movie that you just described. It doesn't require it to be accessible. So the only requirements are for broadcast, the top 4 major stations, NBC, CBS, ABC, and Fox, and then subscription TV systems with 50,000 or more subscribers that are on the top 5 most watched non-broadcast networks: Discovery, HGTV, History, TBS, and USA. So when you go actually outside of that area, it does require that affiliates of those broadcast stations are covered as well, up to the top 60 markets. And the commission, the FCC, is proposing to expand the market size. But if you go outside of that, it's just all voluntary. And so you can't even complain to anyone other than maybe going to the company, which is a possibility, but you can't complain legally and get redress for anything outside of what I just mentioned, which is a huge problem in my opinion.
Do you think you could address the reason that these streaming companies are voluntarily providing audio description? There's a lot of assumptions to be made, but if they're outside of the mandate and they're providing audio description, there's got to be a motivation there.
Actually, I think it's a good motivation. It started as something that maybe needed a little bit of a push, but several years ago, the National Association of the Deaf sued Netflix for not providing closed captioning on all of its programming. And they sued them under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The case eventually settled, and again, the CBAA only goes so far. The CBAA actually does require closed captioning on internet protocol, on programming shown via internet protocol, if that programming had been on television. So anything on television that's reshown on Netflix is covered, but anything beyond that is not covered by the CBAA. So the National Association, do you get that? Okay, so the National Association of the Deaf sued Netflix. And when Netflix settled, they went above and beyond to just basically they had set a deadline for when they were going to they decided to caption everything, and then they beat their deadline by like 2 years. So Netflix decided to caption everything. And I like to say I've seen this happen before with other companies where they're very resistant initially. And then once they drink the Kool-Aid and they realize how good it is to do things that are right for the population of people with disabilities, they then forge ahead. I've seen it over and over again. We had seen it with Apple. The iPhone originally wasn't accessible to blind people, and then they provided accessibility that went way beyond any other company, and then Samsung followed, and then Microsoft followed, and it just keeps on snowballing. The same thing happened with Netflix. Netflix provided closed captioning, and then it said, hey, we're not only going to provide closed captioning, we're going to provide audio description too. Again, I think that they were pushed a little bit because the blind community then came to them, and maybe they were afraid of a lawsuit as well, but they just said, we're going to do everything. And then once they started doing it, Amazon started doing it. And then once Amazon started, well, Amazon then moved first to captioning and then audio description. And then Hulu moved to captioning. And I think that they're probably still a little bit behind on audio description. But I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to catch up as well. So I think that in part it became, I think it was two-sided, or three sides, or to this coin, so to speak. One, they were pressed on a legal basis. Two, they realized that it was the right thing to do. And three, it probably became competitive to a certain extent.
And that competition sounds like it's a race that's different than the race to the bottom. In other words, they're not racing to, okay, well, what can we cut? But they're actually saying, what can we provide? Am I getting that? Okay.
Exactly. I mean, it's a good story.
Daniel, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audiences?
Doing this work has been something I've really enjoyed. It has opened me up to both a different way of thinking about media and accessibility in media, and how I do my own work, which is really, really rewarding. I've gotten to work for some incredible companies that do some really, really good work. And I would just say that what's great about it is that it has had a positive impact, personally speaking, on my life, just in so many ways. So I'm very, very thankful to be a part of this community and to be working in it.
Karen, would you like to add anything else?
I just want to say how much fun it has been for me to share this with Daniel. And Daniel, I want to give you the names of some people to complain to, because if these companies are paying for audio description and people aren't getting it, we should be going to the companies and telling them that there's a problem there. So one thing that I've learned through this is that there are even more gaps than I realized. But it's really fun to be able to work with my son on something as good as
first collaborative project in years. Since high school, since putting me through high school.
Since a science fair.
Since the science, probably since the science fair. Although that was less
podcast about the science fair, because I think that would be a great parallel to what we're talking about now.
I think you need my dad for that one, and we could talk about, what was it, 4th grade when we did cell.
Oh, don't even go there. Don't even go there.
Cell migration. That's not the word.
Cell diffusion.
Cell diffusion. That's what it was. Typical 4th grade science subject. Cell diffusion. Definitely a lot of work that I did myself. That was a project that I definitely.
But you also
definitely summarize for you right now.
But you also did the subliminal
subliminal message, where we recorded me saying I like the red M&Ms the best, and then recorded over it with a Third Eye Blind song, and then played it for people and wrote down which M&M they liked the best, and it worked.
That was cool. There was a good science experiment.
Most people said red. Yeah, that one I understood a little more than cell diffusion.
I have gotten grief over the cell diffusion
You said science fair.
I know, literally for years. But I think that I took it from my sister because it was the first science fair that I ever had to deal with, and I'm so not science oriented.
I could go on this for a while, but the science fair as a whole just needs to be rethought, because there was one kid who would just bring in the most amazing looking science projects every year, and his display boards were covered in like velvet, and it was clear that he hadn't done. I'm sorry, Roy, this isn't what the show is about.
There's relevance here.
Go on like this forever. You could just, that's why I asked how much time you have. Let us go. We'll just keep on going.
Well, what's one thing I would like to ask both of you is, if audiences would like to get in touch with both of you, would you have any social media or places that you'd like to direct them to?
Mom, you go first.
Oh, that you are so bad, Daniel. Well, if they have complaints, the best thing that they should do is file it with the FCC. They should go to www.fcc.gov and then click on Consumer Bureau and then Disability Rights Office. And then from there, go to the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, which will bring them to the audio description rules. But that's pretty long. So if they want to contact me, they can go through Daniel's social media.
great. And if they don't want to complain, if they just want to tell me that they enjoyed something I worked on, or even just say hello, they can go to my website, danielstrauss.com, or they can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Daniel Strauss.
And then Daniel will forward anything that is for me.
No, don't write to me if you need to talk to my mother. No, don't. Just only use those if you want to talk to me. If you want to talk to her, Google her and find another way, because she's already she uses my Facebook to attend jazzercise class, and she's been very.
Now we're getting bad. This is bad. Okay, listen, I'm going to give you an email because he's not letting me go through him. So you can contact me via KPS Consulting at starpower.net.
Because she's been very liberal with the Facebook. I told her she could use it just for the class, and she's been going around commenting on things. And
that is so not true. That is so not true.
Not appropriate. It's not appropriate.
So not true.
It's not why I paid for the membership.
I posted one thing by accident, and
it wasn't by accident. It clearly wasn't by accident. It was clearly on purpose, because it started with her saying, "This message is being posted by me through my son's account." She knew exactly what she was doing.
I totally feel like CNN when the Cuomo siblings are having an interview.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I take that as a very good high compliment. I love that scene. I love that. I mean, it's one of my favorite things to watch. So feel free to have us on anytime. And like I said, we could just banter back and forth.
Right.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Roy.
Thank you. Appreciate it.